Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for investing your time with us on a Friday afternoon. At first, I would like to make an important announcement before sharing the event. Simultaneous translation is available at our event. Please click on the interpretation sign you see at the bottom of the screen to make use of relevant translation, and please choose English option for translation Turkish to English, and please choose French option for translation English to Turkish. Kıymetli katılımcılarımız, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugünkü webinarımızda bizi desteklediğiniz ve yanımızda olduğunuz için çok teşekkür ederiz. Webinara başlamadan önce bir duyuru yapmak istiyorum. Webinarımızda simultane tercüme seçeneğimiz bulunmakta. Bu fırsattan yararlanmak için ekranın altında bulunan Interpretation simgesine tıklayıp Türkçeden İngilizceye çevirileri dinlemek için English seçeneğine, İngilizceden Türkçe çevirileri dinlemek için de lütfen French seçeneğine tıklayınız. Şimdiden hepinize iyi seyirler dilerim. Well, my name is Ceyhun Güler. I am an industrial relation doctor. I am working at Karamanoğlu Mehmet Bey University in Turkey. I study in areas such as the international trade union movement, European trade union movement, and domestic work. I will try to moderate a panel today. Today we have an amazing panel. We will be talking about problems of domestic workers in the epidemic period with an international perspective. In this direction, we have very valuable guests who are experts in their fields. Mr. Tomoya Obokata, Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, United Nations, including its causes and consequences. Ms. Claire Hobden, ILO Specialist on Vulnerable Worker and Domestic Work. And Ms. Lara Nuwayhid, Middle East and North Africa Regional Coordinator of International Domestic Workers Federation. And Mr. Herrie Hoogenboom, Director of FIAMFI Migrant Domestic Workers Network. I would like to welcome all our guests. It is an honor for us to share the same panel with you. Yes, our webinar is organized by the Trade Union of Domestic Workers Solidarity with the support of the Etkinis European Union program. Our panel will take about 1 hour. And if you have questions to our guests during the panel, please write the chat box of Zoom and YouTube channel. We will forward them to our guests. At the end of the panel, if we have enough time, of course, our guests try to answer your questions. Now, before the opening speech and presentation, I would like to share a short video with you. We talk a lot about the problems experienced by domestic workers during the epidemic period. We wrote a lot on this issue, but they had all these problems. We are guests of this story. They are the host. So now you will listen to subject of the problem. Now you will listen to domestic workers with their own words and their own voice.
Ben başlıyorum galiba.
No.
Evet.
Hayır Gülhan Hanım, videomuz var.
Sure.
kadar darp edilen ben, ceza alan yine ben. Adalet istiyorum.
İşsizim, 2 çocukla sokağa atılmak istemiyorum. 7 yıl aynı evde çalıştım, sigorta istedim diye üzerime kapıyı kilitleyip benim telefonumu gasp ettiler. Beni tehdit ettiler, haklarımı talep etmeyeyim diye zorla senet imzalatmaya çalıştılar. Can güvenliği istiyoruz. Hastayım. 4 aydır koku alamıyorum. Hastaneye gidiyorum, başımda atıyorlar, bakmıyorlar. Her yerim ağrıyor.
1 aylık maaşımı istedim diye bayılana kadar darp edilen ben, ceza alan yine ben. Adalet istiyorum. İşten çıkarıldım, iş arıyorum, bulamıyorum. Sağlığım hakkından faydalanıyorum.
Kayıt dışı çalıştığımız için devletin yaptığı hiçbir yardımdan faydalanamadık. Biz de tüm çalışanlar gibi yardımlardan faydalanmak istiyoruz.
Yes, I know that what was told is bad, but I hope you like it. Yes, this period may have affected all groups very badly, but domestic workers were even worse affected by this process. Now we will listen to opening speech of Gülhan Benli. She is the head of the Trade Union of Domestic Workers Solidarity. Gülhan Benli has been working as domestic workers since she was so young. Benli has been fighting for the organization of domestic workers in Turkey since 2009, and Ms. Benli and her friends established the Domestic Workers Solidarity Association initiative and established the Trade Union of Domestic Workers Solidarity on 15 June 2011 as a result of intense legal struggle. Now you will listen to Ms. Benli's opening speech. Yes, Ms. Benli, now it is your turn. Buyurun.
Merhaba, herkese hoş geldiniz diyorum öncelikle. Bugün böylesine büyük bir organizasyona ev sahipliği yaptığımız için çok heyecanlıyım. Öncelikle bunu belirtmek isterim. Öncelikle bütün panelistlerimize buradan bizi kırmayıp katıldıkları için bu etkinliğimize çok teşekkür ediyorum kendilerine. Belki de dünyada ilk defa bu konuda bu denli yetkin isimler bir etkinlikte bir araya bugün burada geldiler. Sabırsızlıkla ben de sunumlarını dinlemeyi bekliyorum. Sabırsızlık duyuyorum bu noktada. Elbette ki bu etkinliğimiz bizim ortaya çıkması, etkinliğimizin ortaya çıkması kolektif bir çalışma sonucu ortaya çıktı. Dolayısıyla etkinliğimizi ortaya çıkartmasında bizlere destek olan Etkiniz programına, AB programına çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Zamanınızı bize ayırdığınız için, bizi dinlediğiniz için sizlere tüm arkadaşlarımızı burada bizi dinledikleri için ayrıca teşekkür ediyorum. Az önce belirttiğiniz gibi sendikamız 2011 yılında kuruldu ve 2011 yılından beri Türkiye'de el işçilerinin örgütlenmesi hakkında birçok mücadele verdik. Devam etmekte. Fazla mücadele verdik. Fazla çıkartmadık. çok fazla, dediğim gibi çok fazla mücadele verdik, çok fazla çaba harcadık. Zaman içerisinde mücadelemiz eş zamanlı kazanımlarımız da oldu elbette. Ancak dünyada olduğu gibi Türkiye'de de ev işçileri haklarında yoksun. Maalesef hayatlarında hiçbir güvenceleri yok. Türkiye'de ev işçilerin güvencesiz ve korumasız olması pandemi sürecinde çok daha kırılgan bir grup olarak öne çıktı. Bu nedenle de şunu söyleyebiliriz ki günümüzde bugün gündüzlü çalışan ev işçisi arkadaşlarımız çalıştıkları yerlerde işten çıkartıldılar. Şu an çalışamıyorlar. Çalışamadıkları için de hiçbir temel ihtiyacını karşılayamıyorlar maalesef. Bu nedenle de çalışan arkadaşlarımız izin kullanamadılar. İzinsiz çalışma durumunda bırakıldılar. Ve hiçbir sosyal yardımdan faydalanamadılar dolayısıyla. Ve bu doğrultuda temel ihtiyaçlarına erişmekte güçlük çektiler. Barınma hakkı, beslenme hakkı, sağlık hakkında gerektiği şekilde faydalanamadılar. Ve bu dediğim gibi şimdi ikinci dalganın içerisindeyiz. Biz ev işçilerinin yaşadığı sorunları katlanarak bizi tehdit etmeye devam ediyor. Bu tüm sorunların tek bir çözümü var. Kayıtlı istihdamı desteklemek ve denetimleri arttırmak. Belirtmek istedim ki hukuki konuda bu alanda ev işçilerinin korunma altına alınması, hukuki korunmanın arttırılması gerekiyor. Sigorta bu anlamda devletin alana ilişkin sigorta teşvikini bir plan doğrultusunda koyması ve ev işçilerinin istihdam koşullarını gözeten hukuki düzenlemelerin oluşturulmasını talep ediyoruz. Buradan aynı itirazla tekrar ediyorum. Hala bizler ev işçileriyiz. Baharı getiren, temizlikten temizleyen, yıkayan, hazırlayan, büyüten, bakan ev işçileriyiz. Toz bezi değiliz. Yaşasın örgütlü mücadelemiz. Herkese saygılarımı sunuyorum.
I think we have some connection problem. We are so sorry for this. But in summary, Gülhan, Benli say so important thing. That's so thank you very much to Miss Benli for this interesting speech. She stressed the situation of domestic workers in Turkey dramatically. Domestic workers in Turkey, they were unable to access their most basic needs during this period, lost their jobs, and their workload is increased. But we wonder so much, what about the world? Now let's listen to our invited panelists. Our first panelist is Mr. Tomoya Obokata. He was appointed as the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, including its causes and consequences, in March 2020. He currently serves as professor of international law and human rights at Keele University, and previously gave lecture at Queen's University, Belfast, and Dundee University. He has extensive experience of working on the issues of transnational crime, human trafficking, and modern slavery. Now we will listen to important presentation of Mr. Obokata's titled Domestic Servitude and the Situation of Domestic Workers Prior to and During COVID-19, Perspectives from the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. Dear Mr. Obokata, we look forward to your important presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Good. Well, I'd like to start by thanking the organizer for inviting me to this very important webinar. And my short talk will focus on the situations of domestic workers from a global perspective before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, my predecessor dedicated a report on domestic servitude in 2018, focusing on the situation of migrant women workers in global domestic economy. As outlined in that report, domestic work is a sector which is particularly vulnerable to exploitation and servitude because of the unique circumstances of working in a private household combined with a lack of legal protection. Domestic work is mainly undervalued, informal, and invisible, often leading to poor working conditions and vulnerabilities which are higher than other sectors of informal employment. Now, it is important to remember that not all domestic work amounts to servitude, but in the event of particularly harsh working and living conditions, combined with control and coercion exercised over workers, domestic work may amount to servitude, which is a contemporary form of slavery. Paid domestic work is highly feminized, with the recent estimates indicating that out of 70 million domestic workers worldwide, 49.2 million are women and 11.5 million are migrant women. These figures indicate that household tasks are carried out by migrant workers in many parts of the world, mostly in high-income countries. In fact, the Arab states, North America, and Europe account for about 52% of all domestic workers worldwide, with the majority being migrants. Many domestic workers live in their employers' homes and are often considered on call to undertake work 24 hours a day. Moreover, if their immigration status depends on their employers, they become particularly exposed to exploitation and abuse. The well-documented example, which was also shown in your opening video, include psychological, physical, and sexual violence, retention of identity documents, withholding of wages, abusive and working conditions and living conditions, as well as excessive overtime. If one or more of these situations applies, the International Labour Organization considers it to constitute forced labor. And when these indicators of forced labors are combined with a lack of choice and strong control over their personal freedom, the domestic workers may find themselves trapped in servitude or even slavery. Also, domestic workers are physically and socially isolated from their families, friends, and peers. And in the event of abuse or exploitation, many of them are unable to leave the situation at their own free will because their residency is tied to their employers oftentimes, thereby not enjoying the freedom of movement. Over the years, international human rights mechanisms, including my predecessors, have expressed serious concerns regarding forced labor and domestic servitude of women, children, and other vulnerable populations such as minorities, indigenous peoples, refugees, internally displaced persons, and older workers in all geographic regions. Forced labor is an absolute violation of fundamental human rights and is considered a crime in most national legal systems. However, victims of forced labor, servitude, or other types of slave-like practices face significant barriers in submitting and pursuing complaints, and thus face severe difficulty in securing access to justice for their violation of rights. In this context, a major challenge is related to the fact that in many countries, domestic work remains poorly regulated and undervalued. In European Union member countries, for example, application of labor rights to domestic workers is very limited, both in law and practice, particularly for undocumented workers. Also, the asymmetry of power relations between domestic workers and their employers serves as an additional obstacle in identifying and protecting the victims of domestic servitude. So what about the impacts of COVID-19 on domestic work and servitude? The unprecedented crisis caused by the pandemic has affected all segments of the population at the global scale, but the social and economic consequences of the outbreaks have been particularly detrimental to those who are already vulnerable before the crisis, and they include domestic workers. In many cases, unemployment, informality, low social protection coverage, and lack of written contracts have prevented domestic workers from accessing aid and relief funds established by the government in a context of the pandemic. At the same time, the ILO estimates that nearly 3/4 of domestic workers around the world, predominantly women, are at risk of losing their jobs. Since most of them live with their employers, losing their jobs might mean becoming homeless without access to Social Security or other safety nets. For example, before the pandemic, migrant women employed as domestic workers in Lebanon were largely excluded from adequate protection under domestic labor law and exposed to exploitative and abusive working conditions. Emerging accounts suggest further deterioration of their situations, particularly after the explosion which hit Beirut on 4th of August, with sexual and other exploitation by their employers likely increasing. In times of COVID-19, domestic workers are also exposed to increasingly stressful and hazardous working environments as a result of substantial increase in their workload to ensure cleanliness and hygiene without overtime pay. In many countries, they do not enjoy paid sick leave and are not protected by any national legislation against workplace accidents and injuries. As a result, they have no choice but to accept these health risks while continuing to work. Moreover, the current pandemic has exposed the pre-existing systemic gaps in social protection and justice systems, including with regards to the identification and prosecution of contemporary forms of slavery. Many governments are understandably overwhelmed with responding to the crisis, but which may further slow down the anti-slavery measures. For example, in the United Kingdom, the National Referral Mechanism, which is designed to identify the victims of contemporary forms of slavery, reported 14% drop in the number of victims identified during the pandemic. And similar trends were recorded in other countries. In summary, although the situation is still evolving, the multidimensional impacts of COVID-19 on contemporary forms of slavery, including domestic servitude, are clear, and therefore there is an urgent need to take actions to mitigate these impacts. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to United Nations Special Rapporteur, Mr. Obokata, for this important presentation. The related presentation gave us very important clues about domestic workers working under slavery-like practices in the world. And it showed to what extent the pandemic deepened these problems. Now, let's focus on the problems experienced by domestic workers around the world in epidemic period with ILO perspective. Ms. Claire Hobden is behavioral scientist and political scientist. She has interdisciplinary perspective. She has over 15 years of experience developing and implementing projects and generating knowledge in various areas of labor policy. Ms. Claire Hobden is ILO specialist on vulnerable workers and domestic work, and she is coordinator of the ILO strategy on decent work for domestic workers. At the same time, she is co-founder of the Domestic Workers Research Network. Now, we will listen to another very important presentation from Ms. Hobden, titled The Impact of COVID-19 on Domestic Workers, a Global Perspective. Yes, Ms. Hobden, we are listening to you in wonder.
Thank you very much for that very nice and unexpected introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with everybody for this important webinar. Now that the pandemic is slowly becoming normal, I think it's increasingly important to make sure that we don't allow the impacts of the pandemic to become normal. So I have a little PowerPoint. I'm going to try to share the screen. If it fails, I will forget the PowerPoint, but let's see. Is everyone able to see the screen? Yes, okay, great. So we've already heard quite a lot about the impacts of COVID on domestic workers from the individual domestic worker perspective, and then also from the sort of broader perspective. I hope that in this presentation, I can fill in some details on the extent of the impact on domestic workers, particularly in terms of their jobs and incomes. And then I'll end with a few words about some of the solutions that we've seen to help pave the way forward to create the new normal. So these numbers, actually, they come from June. We produced these estimates in June 2020. And at that time, there were over 7 million cases of COVID-19. I checked today, and I think that the number is now at 26 million. So that also gave me pause to reflect on just how far this pandemic has gone since June. We know that governments have taken various approaches to curb the spread, and many of them, in order to do so, have adopted lockdown measures. Some from weak sort of voluntary measures, and some have gone to full confinement measures. In general, this has, they've been using physical distancing, they've been closing schools, they've asked people to stay at home, and they've placed limits on both internal and international mobility. Why do I focus on these here? Because these were the factors that we thought probably had the most impact on domestic workers in terms of their jobs and working conditions. What were the implications for workers in general? For many workers, the lockdown measures have meant working from home. A lot of workers in the world can stay at home and still do their work. If they can't, they often have the right to take paid sick leave or paid vacation. In other cases, they have access to either regular unemployment insurance, emergency measures that were taken to extend partial unemployment, or emergency income support measures that governments have taken to try to prevent the worst impacts of the pandemic. But for domestic workers, needless to say, it's not quite so simple. The threat of the virus and certain aspects of these lockdown measures put them at risk of losing their jobs, and it put them in a position where they had to choose between going to work and risking infection, or staying home but not earning an income. Certainly domestic workers were not the only people in this situation, but we do know that they were one of the groups that was particularly affected here. Because as we heard in the last presentation, there were a lot of domestic workers are in informal employment, meaning that they're not covered by Social Security protection. So they did not have the possibility of taking paid sick leave or paid vacation. And even those who are registered to Social Security may not have unemployment insurance specifically. Spain is a good example of a country where domestic workers have the right to Social Security in general, but until the pandemic, they did not have unemployment insurance. So this caused a problem and put many of them in a state of very high vulnerability. So we wanted to quantify and we'll try to estimate the number of domestic workers who were facing these risks. So what we found is that at the peak, on the 15th of May, 74% of domestic workers were facing a very high risk of losing their jobs or their income. They were at higher risk when working in countries with more intense lockdown measures, with stricter lockdown measures, and higher risk also when they were not registered to Social Security. We also found that of the domestic workers who were significantly impacted, of the 74% on the 15th of May, 76%, so the number in the little bracket, 76% of those domestic workers were in informal employment. So there was definitely a correlation between the level of formal employment and the level of vulnerability to job loss and income loss. But what about the other 24%, you might be wondering? I'll get to that in just a moment. So these are the regional estimates that we have. As you can see, there is a pretty high impact across the world. In Europe, the numbers are lower. The percentage of domestic workers who were impacted were lower. And we can attribute this somewhat to the fact that most domestic workers in Europe are covered by labor and social protections. But that does not mean that they were not impacted. I want to make sure that that's very clear. Both formal and informal domestic workers faced vulnerabilities. In the case of informal domestic workers, it was quite likely that lockdown measures were preventing them from going to work, and then they were also not getting paid. In a very informal labor market, employers don't know about their responsibilities, and they just don't have a responsibility in many cases, according to the law. They also don't have the right or access to unemployment insurance, like I was saying before. But formal domestic workers were also at risk. They were more protected, but it's true that because of the general informal nature of the employment relationship, even those employers, even those domestic workers who were working in formal arrangements, their employers may not have been aware of their responsibilities. In many countries, they had the responsibility to continue to pay the domestic worker whether she went to work or not, but the compliance with these laws was very low. I know, for example, in Switzerland, employers were responsible for continuing to hire and pay their domestic workers, but many of them were laid off. Many of them stopped receiving their salaries despite the formal level. So, of course, households sometimes are not able to pay salaries due to their own financial losses. And I think this is also an aspect that's very important to take into account. It has had a huge impact on domestic workers, on migrant domestic workers living in the homes of their employers in certain countries, where because of financial crisis and the pandemic on top of it, employers were no longer able to pay the domestic workers, and they would find themselves in the streets. And I'm sure we'll hear more about those examples soon. So yes, I've already spoken now a little bit about the live-in domestic workers, many of whom are migrants. So the vulnerabilities between live-out and live-in domestic workers, I think, are also a little bit different from one another. We think that the statistics that we see are particularly notable for domestic workers who live outside of the homes of their employers. So they were more likely to lose their employment, whereas live-in domestic workers tended to confine with their employers. For live-out domestic workers, then there was a reduction of hours or job loss, whereas for live-in domestic workers, the work became more intense, and they were often asked to clean more frequently. In either case, they don't have access to the personal protective equipment. In either case, they most likely do not have access to Social Security. And in most cases, they were excluded from income support measures or other emergency measures that were taken to protect people during the pandemic. Finally, one interesting nuance as well is that live-out domestic workers can be at a higher exposure to violence and harassment in their own homes. Often work is a way for people to escape domestic violence. If they're no longer able to go to work, they might be facing a higher risk of violence and harassment in their own home. Whereas live-in domestic workers who are already in a very vulnerable position to violence and harassment at work, or perhaps even more so now under the strenuous conditions. So just a few more words now on giving domestic workers a way out. I started by saying that domestic workers had an almost impossible choice to make between going to work and risking contamination or staying home and not having money to put food on the table for their families. So we thought about some short-term and long-term actions that needed to be taken. The short-term actions are, first of all, to give them priority access to personal protective equipment. I know in France, for example, there was a measure taken to ensure that essential workers, particularly domestic workers providing elder care services, would have access to free personal protective equipment. Employment protection, so the prevention from firing, was an important measure to take to also ensure that domestic workers continue to be paid during the pandemic. And to be included in emergency income support. And here there are a few countries that explicitly included domestic workers in the income support measures. For example, in Argentina, they adopted the emergency family income that is specifically also for domestic workers, including informal domestic workers. And I really want to underline how important it is, since we know that 76% of the domestic workers who were impacted are informal, but the measures to be taken really must target the informal workers. Access to shelter in the case of domestic workers living in with their employers who lost their homes, perhaps when the employers put them on the streets. And raising the awareness of employers to promote compliance with the regulations when they might not be aware or might not care about their responsibilities. And then finally, this point about financially supporting employers to prevent dismissals. So France is a very interesting example where the government took measures to ensure that households still have the capacity to pay their domestic workers, even though they might have lost some income themselves. In the long term, I'm afraid the story is not very new. We've been working on these items for years already, decades, but they remain no less true and far more urgent perhaps today. So we work on extending labor protection to domestic workers, and particularly, I think we need to start looking more closely at how to make sure they're included in occupational safety and health measures. Domestic workers need to first and foremost be considered workers under the labor law in order to access rights. Extension of social protection, and again, particularly in the areas of unemployment insurance, health insurance, and employment injury. As I mentioned, Spain, up until the pandemic, allowed domestic workers to register to Social Security, but they were excluded from unemployment. During the pandemic, they extended the right to unemployment insurance for those domestic workers who were already registered to Social Security. Now it remains to be seen whether measures of that kind will be institutionalized and made permanent. And then finally, really working to promote compliance among employers of domestic workers. For that, we need new strategies that include labor inspections, but that go beyond labor inspections as well, to create a culture and a social norm of compliance among employers of domestic workers. And finally, all of this within a general framework to formalize domestic work, ensure that domestic workers gain recognition as workers who are providing essential services to households in the areas of direct and indirect care. And my final words is just about the very notable importance of workers and employers organizations in addressing the impacts of the pandemic. Domestic workers organizations in particular have played a leading role in delivering emergency assistance, everything from delivering food and water to domestic workers who were in need, to providing legal assistance and making masks. I've heard almost every possible story, and it's been very inspiring. I hope that we'll hear a little bit more from Lara from the International Domestic Workers Federation and the other unions here about that. Employers organizations as well, though, have really advocated for emergency support. They're very rare, these organizations, but where they exist, they have actually played a fundamental role. So I'm really making a call too for employers around the world to start thinking about how important their voice is and ensuring decent work for domestic workers. So in France and Italy, the measures taken in France especially are really the result of the employers, the household employers taking action and asking for the government to protect them. And then finally, the employers and workers organizations have also come together to promote rights. And again, in Italy and Argentina and Belgium, they really advocated directly to the government together to ensure that the needs of domestic workers were taken. So in Italy, domestic workers were originally excluded from emergency measures, and through the bipartite efforts, domestic workers eventually gained some of the emergency protections that were available to other workers. So I'll leave it there. I think I've already taken too much time, but thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Hobden. I think the situation of domestic workers in Turkey, as well as all over the world, as you say, informality is the biggest problem. Domestic workers couldn't benefit from many rights due to informality. We are preparing a report related to domestic workers in Turkey together with the ILO Ankara office. Our findings nearly similar with Ms. Hobden's findings and sharings. Some of the domestic workers lost their jobs, and the biggest problems are lack of job security, lack of social security, and these deprivation caused the problems like they couldn't reach right to housing, nutrition, and health. Some of the domestic workers going on the working, but they have a lot of problem related with this period. Their working time is increased, and the big problem is without working paid leave. And maltreatment is the again most important problem in Turkey. Now I would like to share an important video message with you. The message is coming from Mr. Felipe González Morales. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants. He is Professor of International Law at the Diego Portales University in the Santiago, Chile, where he is also the director of a Master in International Human Rights Law. Mr. Morales' message will give us an international perspective on how migrant domestic workers are affected by the epidemic. We are conveying the message of Mr. Morales to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you, the Trade Union of Domestic Workers Solidarity, for this invitation to participate at this webinar on the situation of domestic workers during the pandemic. I will refer especially to the situation of the migrants in the domestic work as a matter of utmost concern for my mandate as Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants. I have followed the situation in many countries, and I have also addressed this issue in several thematic reports on gender and migration, on access to justice for migrants, and on freedom of association of migrants and their defenders that I presented in July to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. Situation of migrant domestic workers is especially acute and grave in many countries. If migrants as a whole are usually in the margins of the society and invisible to most of them, in the case of migrant domestic workers, this situation is especially grave. And this means that, for instance, labor laws are usually not applied to them, or are applied to a lesser extent than to nationals. Many times it implies that they are not allowed to join trade unions or to form or participate at associations, or in general, they have a broad impact on their capacity to access to public services and justice. In my report on freedom of association of migrants, I emphasized the right of all migrants and especially those in the domestic service, to form or participate at trade unions. This is a key area in order to ensure that they can fully enjoy their human rights, and they can bring their cases without fear of being detained or deported. In general, this is applicable to freedom of association as well, but in the case of trade unions, this is of course a key factor for the development of the human rights of the migrants in the domestic service. The point is that in many respects, migrants in the domestic service are afraid of bringing their cases to denounce the abuses and human rights violations they are victims of, because in case they bring their cases to justice, they are concerned, with good reason in many cases, that there are going to be reprisals against them, that the state or the employer might take actions to sanction illegitimately the domestic worker, or to detain the domestic worker, or to expel it from the country. This situation is especially acute in the case of women who are in the domestic service, migrant women. This is an issue that has to be highlighted because of the invisibility and the lack of possibilities for them on many occasions to bring their cases to justice. So it is very important that all states address this issue in an adequate manner, that they fully guarantee the right of migrant domestic workers to participate and to form trade unions as a key factor and instrument to defend their human rights. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a very good work.
We say thank you very much to Mr. Gonzalez Morales. He shares so important information related with migrant domestic workers during epidemic period. And we will going on discussing the migrant workers now. Our current guest is a representative of a very important organization for domestic workers. Ms. Lara Nuwayhid is Middle East and North Africa Regional Coordinator of International Domestic Workers Federation. Also, Ms. Nuwayhid worked for the International Rescue Committee for many years. She also worked as consultant for Center for Lebanon Studies and Women's Refugee Commission. Still, she is working as consultant for UNICEF too. As you know, exactly 1 month ago, there was a huge explosion in Lebanon. Hundreds of people died, thousands were injured, and tens of thousands became homeless in the related explosion. As in every disaster, the poor and laborers were the most affected in this disaster too. Today, Ms. Nuwayhid will tell us about the situation of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon after the explosion. She will talk about how the epidemic and disaster affected domestic workers with the presentation titled The Situation of Migrant Domestic Workers in Lebanon After the Explosion and Epidemic. Yes, Ms. Nuwayhid, now we are listening to sound of you bring from Lebanon.
Thank you. So my colleagues mentioned a lot of things related to how much domestic workers have suffered the negative consequences of this pandemic and the measures taken by governments to stop the spread of the pandemic. In the Middle East specifically, it's almost all of the domestic workers are migrants. So this adds a layer and puts them at a more weakened position. What we've seen so far is that, and these are things that have already been mentioned, but the most striking things are that domestic workers in the Middle East are being overworked, and this work is not compensated. They are not allowed a day off, but also that racist treatment has increased because domestic workers or migrants in general are seen as the carriers of this virus. And so a lot of termination of employment as well as salary cuts. For the ones that live outside of the houses of the employers, this means that they have no access to food, to pay their rent, to their basic needs, basically. Also, it's really important to keep in mind that the COVID pandemic brought existing issues to the forefront. So a lot of these issues were already ongoing. And these issues are mostly related to the kafala or sponsorship system that is adopted in the region that ties the status of the migrant domestic worker to one employer. And so this employer would have control over every aspect of the migrant domestic worker's life. And obviously that allows for a lot of exploitation, especially in the absence of laws or mechanisms that protect domestic workers. So looking specifically at Lebanon, we see that the situation is that, but then so much worse, because Lebanon has been suffering from an economic crisis for months now. And then after that, as you mentioned, at the beginning of August, there was a devastating explosion. So just looking at how the explosion was addressed also reflects some of the issues related to migrant domestic workers. The statistics that were counting the number of individuals missing or dead or injured did not specify who the migrant population between those. So we weren't able to access any specific or accurate information on the numbers of migrant domestic workers affected. But from our direct contacts, we're able to know that there are 14 dead, 134 injured, and we think it's a lot more, and tens of missing. Also, several shelters and houses of domestic workers were destroyed. And I'd like to point out the shelters because these are the places where domestic workers that were facing abuse or exploitation would go to seek help. But because because of first the pandemic, the doors were closed because of the worry that the virus would spread within the shelters. And then with the explosion where these shelters were physically destroyed. So this made the situation a lot worse. And we need to keep in mind that some of these, a lot of these workers have not been paid since October 2019. So just their basic needs just to survive are not being met. And after the explosion, even the services that were being provided, so the aid that was being provided by different organizations did not include migrant domestic workers. So, and then here we see again a form of possible racism. So the aid was allocated for the Lebanese populations, forgetting that some of the inhabitants of this region are migrants. Or refugees for that. So COVID left them in need of money for rent, in need of food, medication, diapers, menstrual items, etc. And now after the explosion, after the explosion, many are also left in need of shelter and or rehabilitation for their houses, as well as medical attention that they cannot afford. So at this point, from our discussions with migrant domestic workers, we are hearing things like when we try to refer someone who is who is wanting to leave this abusive household and is looking for a place to stay, the best case scenario that the domestic workers groups that we work with are telling us to ask them to find somewhere to stay. They no longer have shelters to host them. A lot of them are choosing to go to stay in front of the embassy or consulate because they are homeless at the moment. And again, the urgency of their need to go back home is brought up a lot. So at this point, this is something that different organizations and sites are working on, and a lot of groups of domestic workers themselves are asking for help from their embassies or consulates, so their countries of origin, to help them return home, even though that would mean that in a lot of cases they are leaving behind their salaries that they already worked for a long time, and they are willing to leave with nothing because the situation has become so dire. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. As we understood, all problems affect the precarious and the vulnerable groups most. And I think the most effective way to deal with these problems is organized struggle. Now I present a guest who has very important experience in organizing of domestic workers. Mr. Herrie Hoogenboom is a trade unionist trying to organize the most vulnerable groups in the employment, including migrants and women. Hoogenboom draws attention with its activist identity too. Hoogenboom, who is currently acting as a director of FMF Migrant Domestic Workers Network, also leads many campaigns with his trade union during this period. Domestic Workers Support Aid Now campaign draws attention for domestic workers in this period in Netherlands. Now we present you the video of the relevant campaign. After watching the video about the related campaign, you will have the chance to listen Mr. Hoogenboom's amazing presentation titled Organizing Migrant Domestic Workers in the Netherlands During COVID-19. Now we are watching the campaign video.
Wij zijn Migrant Domestic Workers en door de coronacrisis zijn wij even niet nodig. Hierdoor hebben wij geen geld en mogelijkheden meer. Wij staan op straat met lege handen. Eten kopen voor ons en onze kinderen. Een dak boven ons hoofd. Zonder jouw hulp is dat niet mogelijk. Mijn naam is Natalia en ik ben een Migrant Domestic Worker. En ik vraag jullie om alsjeblieft te doneren.
Thank you. Now we are listening to Mr. Hoogenboom. Yes, Mr. Hoogenboom, now it's your turn.
Okay, let's unmute. Okay. Thank you very much, Ceyhun, for your very kind words. And let me say that I'm very proud here to represent our trade union in this event, and proud to be invited by this very strong Turkish union, who is an example for in our struggle to unionize and to organize migrant domestic workers. And I'm also glad to be in this group with representatives of the United Nations, ILO, and our proud international organization, IDWF. Let me talk about the Dutch situation. Migrant domestic workers themselves, their community organizations made the first step to sit together with organizations from different communities, from South America, Indonesia, the Philippines, from African organizations. And this was in the first decade of the 21st century, and they said, well, we should organize our communities, and we should organize the domestic workers in our communities, and we should unionize to bring our struggle to the forefront. So they started, they took the initiative towards my union, FNV, Dutch Federation of Trade Unions. It's the biggest union federation in the Netherlands with 1 million members. And since 2008, we've been working together with these community organizations to build up a new union inside the federation. And we've been able to get a lot of support and new members from domestic workers. From the start of this self-organization, we've been focusing on entrance to social security and recognition of the work of domestic workers. Because domestic workers in all countries have a very special and important part in our economy and in our society. They make it possible that 220,000 families in the Netherlands focus on work or on studying, and without their part in our economy, these things wouldn't be possible. In 2011, the ILO came with Convention 189, and the Dutch government, the employers, and the union representatives have pushed hard to get this ILO convention. And the Netherlands was first of the countries to sign it. But since then, they haven't ratified that agreement. So in Holland, we've got still the situation that domestic workers don't have any entrance to social security. They don't have any pensions, no holidays, no holiday payment, no unemployment insurance. And it's basically, this work is done by informal workers in a black market, and especially done by a very big group of undocumented workers coming from all the countries in the world to clean up and to take care of the children of Dutch households. So from the start, this has been our very aim to get this changed and get the government to ratify the ILO convention. And most important thing we do to attain this is to take to the streets, to get people visible. Domestic workers are part of the cleaners sector of arranged in our union federation, and for domestic workers as well as for cleaners, this is the most important thing. Their work is not visible to the rest of society, and employers, clients are not aware about the precarious situation most of the workers are in. So this is our main aim, get this ILO treaty ratified. And the second one is there needs to become measures to help undocumented workers to obtain legal right to live and work in the Netherlands. We've had some very big impact in Dutch society, taking part in demonstrations, taking to the streets, which I must emphasize is very difficult for undocumented people to do. Organizing in a union, being visible, makes their position, makes them vulnerable to state apparatus, and many domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, are getting arrested and deported in the years following. When COVID-19 hit our societies, the domestic workers were one of the first to lose their jobs. Our government demanded that people should start and work from home, which is absolutely right. But most of those clients and employers, they said immediately, we don't want domestic workers in our homes. They're because being afraid of getting diseased, or because they were there to take care of their own chores at that moment. So through the community organizations and through our members, we got a lot of people who really panicked because they didn't have any income, no social security, and no possibility to sustain their staying in our Dutch society. As our union organization started to, with our members, to start a crowdfunding action. So you just saw the movie we made to put out through social media and other media outlets to get as much financial support as possible to help people to obtain at least the most important part, to obtain food and the products you need to stay healthy. And we also started a foundation to give this aid to domestic workers. And we're very happy that we could help a lot of our members to some financial support. But now the crisis is continuing, and a lot of people are still in a real problem and financial problem, most of it. Some of them lost their house as well. They had to live on the streets. And we're still searching, like many organizations do, how can we get more funding and to support our members. In the meantime, we're still focused on obtaining these rights, because COVID-19 made it absolutely visible the problems our members, the domestic workers, have. And it also made it very clear that because the government hasn't done anything to change the situation by ratifying the ILO convention, this problem has become worse and worse. Ik ben namelijk. Ja, snap ik maar. Thank you very much. So that's the situation for the Dutch society and our trade union for the moment. One of the things that we are doing now is that the Parliament of Cleaners inside our union made a strong message which we are going to put forward in Dutch society to as a petition. We hope to get as many people and organizations to support and appeal to the government and the political parties to change this situation once and for all. And it's part of an ongoing campaign, but we really think this COVID-19 situation should help us to bring awareness to everybody on this. Other thing is we, as Migrant Domestic Workers Trade Union, like I said, we are part of IDWF, we are part of EFAD, the European Union of Food, Agriculture and Tourism. And I think that's my main message to you and to everybody who's watching. We should open our trade unions to all workers and also to undocumented workers. They are here, they're part of our societies, and we have an obligation to make a just an equal society, and we can only do this by giving people voice and giving them an entrance to the same labor rights as all of us, the normal workers on the normal sectors have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoogenboom. This is really amazing presentation, and I would like to say I think we have a little problem related with the translation, but I would like to say that we are learning too in technically. We try to use in Zoom simultaneous translation too. We are so sorry for participants this problem. Mr. Herrie Hoogenboom gave us very important information. He made the importance of the organized struggle visible once again, I think. I thank all our panelists. They shared very important information with us today. We have seen how important it is to discuss such an important issue internationally. Together with evid-sen, with the support of the Etkinliği European Union program, we will endeavor to share a comprehensive report with you in the coming days in the line with information we have obtained in this panel. If you have any question, we could get as many as our time allows. I saw in the chat box for 3 questions. Maybe I could forward them to our guests. And we know maybe the one question answer, are there any domestic workers cooperative which provide food to its members and employees during COVID-19 period? One of is FIANFI, I think. And another trade union is United Nations from Domestic Workers Alliance. And I know International Domestic Worker Federation share the funds with national organizations. If I am wrong, Miss Lara threw to me. And now another 2 questions to Miss Hobden. One is from Güler Toksöz. Can the relative low rate of being affected from COVID-19 in European and CA countries be related with their migrant status as live-in workers? And the other question, the Dutch representative voted for the ILO convention in 2011, but the Dutch government has not ratified it. Has ILO the power to enforce compliance? Thank you so much. Yeah, Ms. Hobden.
Yes, sorry, I'm just looking for the right button. Well, the answer to the question about Europe and Central Asia, it could be that the live-in migration, the live-in migrant domestic workers could also have influenced that. We don't have a reliable way of counting the number of domestic workers who live with their employers. In the statistics, it's not very easy to see. So we can't say for certain, but it could definitely have an influence. And then for the other question, well, the ILO promotes its conventions through a few different channels. One is providing information to governments as well as to workers and employers organizations about what the requirements are in order to comply with the convention. So we provide the kind of assistance that a government might need in order to determine if they can and want to ratify the convention. Every government, every member state of the ILO has the responsibility to discuss in their parliament or equivalent body whether or not they want to ratify the convention. If they decide through that legislative process that they do not want to ratify the convention, there's very little that the ILO can do at that stage to change their minds. I think this is where the social partners, the unions and the employers organizations become so essential, because at the end of the day, these are domestic issues, I mean, at the national level, and mobilizing the unions, the workers, and also the employers in some cases can really help to to raise the level of visibility and importance of domestic work and the ratification of C-189. The ILO can continue to provide assistance to unions and employers organizations in that effort. We're just not in a position to tell the government what they should and shouldn't do if the government itself has already decided that they don't want to ratify.
Thank you so much for your answer. And thank you so much to our panelists for their contribution to our event. Thank you so much, Mr. Obokata. Thank you so much, Ms. Hobden. Thank you so much, Ms. Nuwayhid. And thank you so much, Mr. Hoogenboom. I would like to thank all participants for taking their time and attending our event. Stay healthy, stay in solidarity. Good afternoon, everyone.